Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Thunderbird Fourth Industrial Revolution Fireside Chat with Tech Leaders. So today we will be joined by Cariapa Betnia from Capgemini, Anja Kaspersen, former UN Director of Disarmament and also former head of innovation at the ICRC, and also Lara Bikes, head of sustainability, partnership, and social impact at the startup Sonder. And she was also chief sustainability officer at HP Enterprises. So today, those be moderated by my colleague Mark Esposito and Nicolas Davis. So before giving them the floor, let me share a few words about Thunderbird. So as I am Landry Signé, Senior Director and full professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, where I lead the Fourth Industrial Revolution and Globalization 4.0 Center, as well as the Washington, D.C. campus. And as you know, Thunderbird School of Global Management is the vanguard of global leadership, management, and business education for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. We have been ranked as the best school providing a master's in management by the Wall Street Journal and Time Higher Education. And we are hosted at Arizona State University, also ranked as the best school in the US for innovation ahead of MIT and Stanford, as well as the best for the sustainable development goals. So today, first conversation will be between my colleague Nicolas Davis and Anja Kaspersen. So without taking a longer time, I will call Nick and Anja to join us on the stage, and I will let them the floor for moderation. So Nicolas, you have the lead.
Thank you very much, Landry. And here is Anja. Nice to meet you, Anja.
Hi.
Hello, everyone. Look, it's great to be with you all. I hope you've been enjoying these sessions hosted by ASU and Thunderbird as part of the UNGA and Global Compacts discussion series. I'm super excited to be able to have a chat with my friend Anja Kaspersen for the next 20 minutes or so, before handing over to Mark to bring in Cariapa from Capgemini, and then it'll be back with me again from about 22 to finish with Lara Burks. Now, starting with you, Anja, one of the reasons I'm so excited to chat is because Anja is a true cross-sector leader with a lot of insight for leaders in all sectors, but I think particularly interesting for if you're a business leader and part of the Thunderbird alumni or part of the broader Global Compact business community, because Anja's backgrounds are super interesting. As you heard from Landry before, she's worked with the UN, with the World Economic Forum, with the ICRC, and as a diplomat, but she also is a businesswoman and an academic as well, so she comes with many hats. I've worked with Anja for many years, and I can mention many things about her, but let me just focus on two areas that might be germane to today's discussion that I want to touch on. It's her leadership in international security, and in particular in how technology relates to security. And secondly, it's Anja's role as an international gender champion, someone that is really focused on bringing more gender balanced and diverse voices into the multilateral global discourse. Now, we love at the World Economic Forum and in design thinking spaces to start wide and narrow down and become more focused. So, Anja, let's start as wide as we can, and then narrow into what you think is most interesting for the audience and for us to talk about today. For you, what are the most interesting and important trends to do with emerging technologies that you think the private sector in particular needs to pay attention to? Let's start there.
First of all, you can hear me okay? Yes,
Yep.
super. So thank you so much, Nick, for inviting me to take part. As you mentioned, we have had the pleasure of working together in the past, and I never cease to be amazed by your incredible skill in all areas, and what more suiting than to have this conversation. Landry was saying, this is the Thunderbird Fireside chat. So even the name itself sets us up for a very dynamic and fiery discussions on this one. But I'm thrilled to be taking part of this, Nick. So thank you again for having me here. So, as you mentioned, if I could start in the other end, and we're definitely going to go wide and big and then sort of narrow down. But you did mention that I have a transdisciplinary background. And I think that's very much at the crux of the matter, that we are entering into an age and complexities, both in the risk domain and overarching strategic trends, but also societal trends that requires us to rethink not only the frameworks, but the tools of which we address those frameworks to operate within those frameworks. So definitely, for the students listening to this, which I'm sure there are, including business people, to really take some time to pause about what kind of transdisciplinary skills you need to have part of your team. How can you, as a new student, really invest in getting that transdisciplinarity that you require to try to connect the dots? Because I think this is definitely the time where that is a precious commodity. Connecting the dots is asking the right questions. You can have answers for sure, and we're certainly coming up with a lot of tech solutionist answers to a lot of different things. But did we ask the right questions to begin with? And this goes to your issue around design thinking, really kind of applying those types of methodologies, be it through foresight, through design thinking, or a combination of the two. So this has benefited me, hugely. Now, to the bigger strategic trends, and this could take hours. We can spend hours discussing this, and there's no shortage of issues to discuss for sure. Open a newspaper and you think where do I even start on all of these things. But I think one of the overarching trends that I see, and if I can mention two just to get us going, and then we can sort of narrow down. One is very much around this, continuing geostrategic competition, where we're hedging above collaborating. That doesn't mean we're not cooperating. We can still cooperate around more narrow issues where we find common interest, but there's no genuine effort of choosing collaboration above hedging. And this is not a new phenomenon per se. Technology is certainly enabling a lot of opportunistic actors to operate within this space of hedging. And that's a trend which I think will deeply impact on international relations, so how we relate with each other, in the multilateral domain, or even how we do the tech governance piece. And I know you've been doing some work thinking around, how do we build greater preparedness in the health domain, which is particularly relevant for all of us right now that we are facing a global pandemic. And you would know from all of this, and I know you've done a lot of work of this issue around narratives and shared realities. And if you're hedging, what's your ability to share a sense of reality? What are the challenges? How do we respond to them? Who needs to be involved in responding to them? What are the right tools to respond to them? And when we have this level of divergent interest and divergence among actors, where even the vernacular is different, how you define what winning looks like or what losing looks like. There's no shared, and sometimes by design and sometimes by default, it's very difficult to move things forward. So in a geostrategic landscape, this hedging is a very important phenomenon, which is important to reflect on, that things are not always the way it seems. There might be a intention behind to create a certain narrative or certain dynamics. The other thing, and I alluded to it, which is the issue of fragmentation of actors. And in the military domain, often when we talk about tech, because you asked me about technology, when you're investing, and there's a whole story around investments and innovations and technology in the military domain, you're often trying to fill a real or perceived capability gap. And I'm putting emphasis on perceived, because when we talk about new technologies, particularly in the area of cyber and AI and others, there's a lot of perception going on as well. And that's dominating the narrative as much as what's really happening on the technology development side. And those are important things to reckon with. Whereas in the business world, and this is important for the business leaders, you are often trying to, deliver a return on investments, maintain a market share, make sure that your revenue models and can sustain the kind of current levels of disruptions, be that a global pandemic or disruption to manufacturing supply chains or other types of more global issues such as climate, etc. But you're fundamentally coming at this from different perspectives. So how you build a shared community or shared reality within this, given that incentives are so divergent. And so incentives are also two different things in this landscape. And then you add in what I was referring to before, the geostrategic competition, which means that when you are trying to initiate certain types of collaboration, there might be national disincentives of promoting and supporting those kind of collaborations. So without going into detail, and I would prefer not to speak on country-specific issues, and I should also emphasize that I'm, of course, only speaking in my personal capacity here. Those are two overarching trends, this issue around competition, narratives, and hedging, and this issue around what gaps are you trying to fill and the fragmentation of factors. So correlating trends, two trends, but correlating. So maybe we can start there and we build on that discussion. I know you also have used and experience in all of this.
No, this is great. Thank you, Anya. So imagine that there's a group of CEOs that come to you and say, Anya, what should I be investing in terms of how to understand the potential risks or evolution of the world from a cross-country perspective? I understand what you're saying about increasing geostrategic competition, and I see the fragmentation and the misalignment of interest there. What should I be practically doing? Who should I be hiring, or what kind of information should I be looking at? What kind of skills should I be developing myself in order to have a better touch point, a better sensitivity to this? What advice do you give to particularly business, private sector leaders?
I think so. I'm going to answer that question. I just, there's a lot of focus on connectivity. And that's definitely something every CEO is reckoning with, be that, having their remote offices work, be that in the office or vis-a-vis the clients that they are serving. There was a very interesting article, and I can't remember the name of the author, but was published by the ICRC, so my previous employer, and this was on their blog space, called Cyber Poverty Line. And it was mentioning specifically whether Africa was finding themselves above or below the cyber poverty line. What that meant, did they have the capabilities to protect themselves in the ways that they should in this new type of reality? You can easily rephrase that a little bit, so borrowing on that term and also speak about the digital poverty line. Having access doesn't mean that you have agency. And I know agency is an issue that you worked on a lot, Nick. Are you empowered to engage with the technology that you have access to use? So that level of empowerment is critical. So that's one kind of bigger issue that I think every industry leader also need to really reckon with as we roll out these things, as you sell products, as you expand your services into new areas, and really ask the right question. We're rolling this out, or the community or the organization we're doing it with have the actual capability to engage with this in a meaningful way. So, and that's so so you're not just looking at the effectiveness of it, but if you want to optimize something, you also have to ask some core questions of what exactly you're trying to optimize and at what cost, and do you have the capability to manage and understand it? Down to a much more kind of granular level, within an organization, I've seen it time and time again in my professional career, the lack of technology fluency. The lack of a common vernacular, especially when you're trying to combine different disciplines and different working groups together. The issue around terminology that you use. How do you make sure that you have the right type of terminology? But on the fluency, you see this in private organizations, you see this in international organizations, you see this in military structures, that the AI fluency, and if you have the knowledge at the top level, is critical for how the culture evolves in the organization and how you engage with these technologies, both for internal uses, but also in the whole life cycle of your development and deployment of these technologies. Now, this brings a very important point, which is important when you start talking about sensitive technologies, especially maybe in the security domain. Do you have the right kind of people that not only have the fluency, but you have the process of doing proper validation? We're talking about very intricate vendor processes. If you talk about cloud-based systems, I mean, the number of vendors that you are engaging with is mind-numbing. If you talk about, an automated, process, again, it can be very heavily labor-intensive to run an automated process. You may not have a good insight into the data itself or even how the algorithm is making its decisions, but it's still a labor-intensive process to put all of these things together. Do you have the right type of skills in the right time at the right place? And I participated in a big conference on this issue about a year ago, and it was quite interesting to me, without mentioning names, how many of big companies, and these are really serious big companies, and I was moderating a panel with their chief technology officers, and they all reached a conclusion that they have gone through the technology kind of hype round. They have invested in the acquisition and the development of technologies and integrating it. And now they were kind of finding themselves a little bit at a halt because of the lack of people skills, but also the lack of people skills to address fundamentally different processes. Because deploying technology, targeting optimization of processes is quite different from hiring and deploying people towards fundamentally people-centric processes. And those require very different perspective. If you're deploying technologies into more cognitive processes, you naturally need people with more experience into brain science and behavioral sciences, health sciences, and even, in the philosophical domains and ethical domains. Whereas if you're trying to basically create a better accessible, schedule of your trains running, that's a different type of skill sets. But currently, few companies can afford doing both. So they're deploying the same type of teams to do this, to essentially do the whole spectrum of different processes that are utilizing technology in one way or the other. So for me, a lot of this comes back to culture. And I think this is a highly underestimated area. We speak a lot about, optimization of the organizational structures, etc. But we don't speak enough about culture. And just to give one example from my kind of core domain, which is international security, this is deeply also challenging in many Western countries in particular, but across the board. There's something called mission command in mission structures, not unlike any type of delegation of authority structure in a private company. Now, if you have algorithms deployed in various levels of that delegation of authority, are you sure that the order that went out from the top is translated and executed the way it was intended when you come further down the layers and you're dealing with highly contextual, fast-moving realities where you are both feeding the data and also trying to base your decisions on those data, whatever way and sensory technologies that have been helping you to collect those data. So there are some very fun, but a lot of it comes down to two things: fluency and culture, and investing in asking the right questions.
That's fantastic. Look, we've only got a couple of minutes left before we need to hand over to Mark and Karyapa and the next perspective. A couple of questions have come on the chat there around particularly what is needed in the global south and in sub-Saharan Africa. And I know you've had experience in that region. Can you maybe just finish by giving us a couple of insights from your work, whether related to more general procurement, humanitarian situations or security? Is there something there you think would be a baseline investment for those countries, and maybe in particularly the French-speaking African nations, which Dr. Clotilde Monguia mentions in the chat? So if you just finish with a minute on that, Anya, that would be fantastic.
So, I said at the outset, I'll be careful to comment on specific regions, but as I see some of the questions that is in the chat, and I would highly recommend you actually to look at the article that was published I was referring to, which is called, I think it's called Below the Cyber Poverty Line. It was published by someone that was writing this on behalf of the International Committee of the Red Cross, their blog space. But it speaks exactly about this issue. How do you as you roll out techno solutions to things, have you integrated this properly into the educational systems? It's not just giving a bunch of iPads to school children. Do you have a digital hygiene? I like to call it digital hygiene package that goes with it. Do we have the right kind of civic education systems in place as you roll out technological solutions for holding elections? Do we have the right kind of discussions and debates? Is the media people trained in, do they have the right kind of fluency to be able to be a good checks and balance? So I think fundamentally it is, what I'm trying to say here is that wherever this is rolled out, and whether it is in Africa or elsewhere, really investing in people and investing in the tools and the tools of understanding and knowledge, that people can utilize is, I don't think we're doing enough of it, and I think this will be even more important. One thing I will say about Africa, and this is, I was in this was actually a forum event a couple of years ago, and it was a very prominent politician in Africa that attended, one of these discussions that the World Economic Forum was organizing. And she was pointing out in the discussion that one of the things that she worried about more than anything else, and this goes back to this complexity of risk. So we speak a lot about tech solutionists, or tech. I mean, I'm a huge believer in tech, solutions to a lot of, long-standing problems. She mentioned something to me that blew my mind, and I'm still thinking about, was how long-standing poverty and malnourishment of children has caused a large part of the future generation of Africa, current and future generation of Africa, not to ever be able to participate properly in work life because of emotional stuntedness, only resulting from malnourishment. Now, here's where tech can play an important role. I don't have the solutions, nor do I have the insights in knowing exactly what that means. But if she's right, and we have a generation that will fall out of the conventional work life, are there ways that technology can help making sure that these generations and that these special needs can be addressed through other means? So I think, to really listen to African leaders, to understand what are the fundamental issues that are trying to be addressed, rather than trying to address this in a, let's roll out what works elsewhere and not, taking those right adaptations to the local context. And this is for any country, by the way. I'm not singling out Africa. I think it's for every single country. And if COVID has taught us anything, it is how interrelated we are, how any type of solution needs to be a joint one, but also how we're all relating to very specific local contexts and environments.
Anja, thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our real-life fireside chat in Oslo, hopefully at the point in time when travel is a little bit more free. But thank you so much for spending the time with us. Thank you to the audience for posing your questions to Anja. And I'm going to hand over now with gratefulness to Mark. So Anja and I will hit leave. Thank you. We'll be in touch. And Mark, you'll come in.
Yes, great, and I think Carrie. So I think ready to start, Carrie, if it's okay from your side. Do you hear me great?
I hear you well.
Great, great. So we go into our second important conversation with tech leader. This time we have in Carrie Maya as part of our tech leaders. Carrie works right now as the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer at Capgemini. I think you are in the Capgemini event, Carrie, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Carrie and I, we are almost knowing each other for a decade, which scares me a lot, even saying that. We started around 2011-12, and then Carrie started his journey exploring different kind of careers option, but then he started to get solid into research, and of course in the private sector, in the corporate world, he spent time in Paris in the startup environment as a researcher, and then he was able to integrate Capgemini, I think a year and a half ago, or here, something like this. Now Carrie has a global role with the firm, and it's leading the initiative really in interfacing technology at a much deeper level, in a way that I think is becoming a narrative for you. But before going into the nature of the work you're currently doing, Gary, two things important to mention. You wrote actually a book, and I was honored to be able to see the work as it was happening, which actually also had a very, I think, compelling title, The Blockchain Alternative, Rethinking Macroeconomic Policy and Economic Theory. And then you started to develop the theory of fragmentation after that. And I think there is a connection between the two. So maybe as an icebreaker, as you start maybe to share with us what brought you to where you are in your life right now. To me, as I know you, besides everything as a friend, and of course as a colleague, as a co-researcher, I know that the book and the theory of fragmentation and everything you did around that shaped a lot what you have become right now as a thinker in the field. Do you want to share a little bit about it with us? And then I'll be able then to redirect it more towards the work you're currently leading at Capgemini.
Okay, perfect. I'll try to be as brief as possible because it's a rather long story. But before I got into working in tech and doing economic research, I was a legionnaire in the French Legion. And when I spent a lot of time in places of hostility, I realized that there was this very rather interesting connection between conflict, conviction, and capitalism. Conflict was always an output. When people didn't have an agreement on a certain kind of conviction, it always resulted in conflict. But the engine that allowed it to do, because wars are expensive, was capitalism. And so that really got me interested because I was in the army for 5 years, deployed in multiple zones of hostility. And I said, I want to figure it out. And I started asking questions about capitalism. And the more I got into it and I understood it, I did a lot of economic history and I really tried to understand how we got to where we are. And then started looking for alternatives. Because I found that there were inconsistencies and problems with the current narrative and paradigm of capitalism. That actually got me to Bitcoin because it was something that was really blowing up in 2012 and even before that. And that's how I started kind of figuring out how the capitalistic machine works from a mechanistic point of view. The theory of fragmentation actually started building up in my mind at the same time as I understood how blockchain operated. And one of the things that I was trying to figure out was, if we are to change the existing value chain, the way that an infrastructure is actually created, will it be able to address some of the issues? So with blockchain, for example, the book that I wrote was mostly trying to address this concept that if we went to the blockchain and we had our financial systems based on it, would it be able to reduce the problem of excessive debt, which is something that plagues almost every major economy today? Because it was a lot capable of giving us more transparency, and maybe that transparency could be converted into clarity. I'm sure you guys have been following the FinCEN scandal that's opening up right now. It's these kind of issues that I wanted to see if we could address with the blockchain. The book was quite exploratory. There's a lot of economic history. There's blockchain as well in it. And there's a lot of stuff which is connected to complexity economics, and we can talk about that a little bit later on. But essentially, this was kind of an exploration that I did over there. And that's how I got into theory of fragmentation, because the more I understood about technology, if you understand blockchain or you understand any one technology, it becomes easier to understand the second one. And so that got me to AI and NLP more specifically. And I realized that every time a technology is created and put into any kind of a system, it has the same kind of effect. The first, it's never put randomly somewhere. It goes to a very specific component of the value chain. Whenever we put technology, it's reducing the transaction cost. And the transaction cost in this case is information processing and communication cost. That leads to a certain kind of dilution of mechanistic hierarchies with top-down command and control structures. And we're seeing this today manifesting in different ways. You hear increasing amounts of large companies working with startups. There's a huge kind of impetus to be part of the startup world and really have that porous kind of connection with what's going on within your ecosystem. And this is what essentially the theory of fragmentation was exploring. It was trying to figure out, why is this value chain diluting every time we have a new technological wave that gets that society is immersed in? And if this is something that is happening again and again, it's not a fad, it's a trend. So how do you actually construct your strategy, your IT stack, your operating model, your incentive structures, your team diversity, et cetera, in order to be able to better adapt to this kind of a paradigm?
Great. So that clearly has also created a link to the kind of work you're currently doing right now. I think The difference from before is that there was a lot of you researching on very nominal level. You're mainly thought leadership as a researcher. Now, although you keep on having your thought leadership, you're integrated into a much larger context. And your work now actually inspires, is supporting, but is equally conditioned by so many other factors as you're now integrated, a leading technology companies, consulting firm, advisory. I would say these days, as you mentioned yourself, every business is a technology business, right? And they include, I think, Capgemini. In one of the latest reports you actually contributed, you talk about the K-shaped recovery. We've been hearing a lot about this lately. And I know I don't want to get into the cliche about it, but I think the way you have been understanding this is interesting for us to hear it. And so if you can maybe use the K-shape as a way for us to understand the nature of the work you have done, and maybe tell us more about this work that is produced by Capgemini about the technology and new normals, because I think it's this interface that we want to understand through this chat with you.
Okay. So I kind of started getting a bit irritated when I saw the first articles coming out with regards to how the economy is going to evolve and adapt to COVID. And the big narrative that kept coming up was return to normal, return to normal. And there was V-shaped recovery and L-shaped recovery and all these kind of alphabet soup of recovery models. Primarily disagreed with them because of the fact that I said that there is no normal. The only thing that's constant in any kind of economy is a change. Your base operating model of an economy is entropic, not equilibrium. You can have periods of equilibrium, but it's a temporary state of affairs. The natural state is something which is entropic. And when I started thinking about it from this perspective, I said K-shaped recovery seems a lot more sensible to me, because what's actually happening is COVID actually accelerated the future, you could say, to a certain extent. And a lot of transition started happening towards technology. But the way that it was done, and this is why policy is so important over here, is that a lot of the money that was actually pumped into the economy was grabbed up immediately by the people who had closest access to it, which are the large firms, et cetera, and mostly tech firms. And the inequality that we've already been seeing growing in our societies for a long time is now getting accelerated even more, because the intention was very good, but the execution is happening in a very different way. So when I saw that, and when I say K-shape, by the way, for people who are not familiar with it, it's essentially society kind of divides in two directions. So it's like a K. On one side, you have people who are in the tech world, or people who've got easy access to this monetary stimulus and fiscal stimulus policies which come inside. They use it and they start kind of like, creating a different kind of elite system. And what's left on the bottom are the people who are not part of that conversation, the ones who are getting let go of their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So you're having more and more dissonance kind of like expanding as it goes on. So obviously, stating a problem is half of it. The other part is like, how do we need to think about it as a solution? And this is where I was very happy when I wrote the Future Thinking Report along with other CTIOs at Capgemini, because we realized that technology can be an antidote to this. There is a possibility to use technology as a way to react to this. And it doesn't mean that you have to be a tech firm. You could be a restaurant, for example, something that's very brick and mortar. But at the same time, if you're now able to have like a platform and you can use data analysis, et cetera, you have a bigger chance of actually being a contender in this change that's happening, rather than being a spectator or even worse, a victim. And so there's multiple examples with regards to how technology can actually act as an antidote that we have enumerated in our Future Thinking Report. But the key point is we realize that there are certain technologies that need to be focused upon for the next 18 months. It's easy to talk about, something that's very generic or something that's out there like quantum computing. We look at quantum computing too, but for us, it's on the third horizon. It's not on the first horizon. And so the report actually showcases this adaptability process, the way that you can actually survive and not even thrive, so that you can have some way of reducing this K-shaped recovery, which I don't think is a good idea in the way we're going.
Right. Kerry, on this, right, because it's an intriguing part. I think the challenge of the K-shape is that it's a structural diversity. The gap is structural by design, right? It's not supposed to converge at any point in time. When you're hearing about V-shape, W-shape, any form of shape, the assumption is that no matter who you are, you're going to be part of that either decline or ascent. But in the K-shape, by structure, there is a decline and there's an ascent. Do you think that technology can, to some extent, address it, as you mentioned, when somehow many of the technology companies are the one that created the divergence in the first place? I mean, how do you reconcile this tension?
by actually having some kind of principles and models in the way that you actually go about creating and deploying technology. So remember I mentioned something about the theory of fragmentation. And what we realize is there's more and more impetus right now for us to work with startups and the people who are actually creating this new kind of technology. What we're doing is we're not just sitting and looking at them and trying to buy them over. We are actually participating with them. We do like 50% kind of partnerships, which allow these new companies, because, you know, majority of employment is actually in small and medium-sized companies. It's not in the huge firms and like the ones that I'm in. And so what we want to be able to do is two things. First of all, we want to be able to use these new technological advances. At the end of the day, we are a business. We have to think about it, right? But at the same time, by having these kind of joint partnerships, we're having a nice osmosis process with these new startups and medium-sized companies. We can now provide them with resources that they might not be able to have. We are a large tech firm. We can do infrastructure level kinds of projects. So there's an incentive for them to come and work with us because the solution can be scaled. And for us, it's a quid pro quo because we are now able to integrate really emerging technology into our, you know, existing solutions and product portfolio. So that's kind of like one way we're going about it. This is one way that I think you can address it from a micro level. But I think if you're asking me from a macro level, then a lot of it is based on policy and the way that this is actually money is put into it and how people are actually getting benefits from the new kinds of capital injections that happen. And yeah, at the end of the day, I think it's important to remember that large institutions or big companies or small companies, whatever it is, it's not some abstract concept. It's people who are making decisions over there. And so a lot of the work that I do today is to ensure that I can help leaders and decision makers in large companies make better and smarter decisions. And so a lot of my work is now kind of like angling towards simulation, and there's a reason for it, and I can elaborate if needed.
So Kerry, on that, right? So you have a process of coming to these ideas that, of course, needs to be tested, pivoted. You know, it's a quite collective, collaborative, and it's always, as you say, very, very entropic because it's a constant evolution. But then you find yourself, for example, trying to roll them out in the real economy, in the real market, where somehow the degree of sophistication on why we should go in a certain direction seems to be still struggling with the idea that maybe we want to have a recovery by reinstating what we had before. Right. And we all know that the issue with what we had before is exactly what we had before. You know, it was an ill-conceived system in many ways, and COVID has simply amplified the fragilities. How do you bring that conversation to people that might have not come from your same thought process? Because it's easier in a context like the one we're having right now. We've been working together and we have wavelength. But when you're doing, for example, with a company, let's say a company that is really engaging in a conversation, digitalizing my production, my service, whatever. How do you close that gap?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously thought leadership is very important because you need to have like an educated opinion, and that opinion needs to be validated theoretically and obviously even practically. But if I were to boil off the question that you just asked me, the precipitate that would be left behind is uncertainty. The reason that we have a certain kind of nostalgic inkling to go back to how things were before is simply because of the fact that we know it. The human brain is not very good at dealing with uncertainty. We have an issue with that. We prefer to know things, and that's why we have comfort in routine. And so one of the things that we're doing over here is we're trying to change this narrative of data-driven companies. Data-driven companies always lead to models, and models always lead to a PowerPoint conversation. Today, what we're doing is we're saying that, no, we can use data in a different kind of a way. We can now use different kinds of simulations at every layer of the tech stack and the value chain to showcase how, when you put a new technology inside, it's going to affect your value chain in a different way, and how is the new possibilities that are created by the application of this technology, what kind of new growth strategies can be built, what kind of new opportunities can be explored. This needs to be simulated, because when you can show something in terms of a picture, it changes the dynamic. You no longer have a PowerPoint conversation. You have a conversation which is more capable of helping you create a unified image or a metaphor in minds of the decision makers who are in front of you. And now you can instigate a change in the narrative. And then you can do your KPIs and your models and all those different kinds of things. When we reverse that and we put the models first and then the narrative gets mixed up and then there's no visualization, it leads to suboptimal decision making. And that's kind of like what we're doing today. We use everything that we can get. We use data science. We use a lot of emerging tech. AI is something that we're using, extensively. We take into consideration the ethical constraints which have come there because you have to adapt it to a certain kind of context. And we use a lot of creative design. So that kind of like cognitive diversity, which is what Anya was kind of, referring to before, is now going to be able to be showcased in the form of simulations. And now you have a better way to look at the uncertainty that's in front of you, because you can have different scenarios. And what we're trying to do is give business leaders the courage to lean into ambiguity.
Right. Kerry, it's interesting, as Anya was mentioning about cognitive diversity. I know you did work on cognitive as well.
Yeah.
I think we were in Paris together when you were doing your talk.
Yeah.
And it was centered around cognitive and also the rising paradigm that you're dealing with. Listen, in the work you're doing at Capgemini, there is the idea of the portable enterprise, the fact that you're tapping on open innovation and open source. I mean, these are conversations that seems to be a bit estranged from what other technology advisory firm would do, right? But you actually are pioneering this, and it's so like, I would say, counter tendency, so to say.
Yeah.
So and I think the reason why you're doing that is because from your own words, you notice that right now the acceleration is going in the direction of responsiveness versus mainly preparedness, which is really what used to be before, right? So how do you, first of all, what are the portable enterprises and why open source? Okay. And how does this play a big role in the work you're doing?
Yeah, so as you have more and more technology diluting the value chain, what we find is these mechanistic hierarchy structures are not really very suited for it, because the more information that's created through the emergence of new companies that are leveraging new technology and being able to combat the incumbents head on, this is creating a tremendous amount of movement. So you're constantly getting bombarded by information. If you have a pyramidal structure in which information comes from the bottom, goes all the way up to the top, someone makes a decision and then people act on it, it's too slow. It's out of sync with the throughput of information that's coming in. Secondly, like we mentioned before, there's multiple emergences in different types of technology. AI, for example. Now we've got GPT-3. It's a huge leap in terms of like what is possible with NLP. It's going to create new kinds of businesses, et cetera, et cetera. So when we started talking about the portable enterprise, a lot of people think it's just about decentralization and blockchain and distributed ledger. We're not saying that. We're going much further beyond it. We're saying, how does a company actually create an operating model which uses, whether it's migration to cloud, because it's just better for you, whether it's open source, because it can be safer for you, whether it's working with a specific technology which allows you to connect more easily with the external ecosystem and get that osmosis, which I mentioned before. That's what we call the portable enterprise. It's something that's easier, it's much more valuable, it's got more flexibility, it's modular to a certain extent. And just to give you an example on why we are, we are supporters of open source. First of all, that's because a lot of the developments in technology happen better when you have a large group of people who are trained, who can come together and make something really, really powerful. Secondly, we actually did this report, which is called the DevSecOps report, which was done by my Future of Technology unit in Capgemini Invent. And what we found was those companies which are using open source software have a less threat ratio compared to people who control their entire stack. So that was actually very surprising. It was a key insight for us, because what you're essentially trying to do when you go and convince these people, which is what your question was, you have to talk to them in terms of what they understand. And they need to be able to see how it's going to reduce their TCO, their total cost of ownership, how it's able to create more cash. I always look at the only KPI is cash, not because of anything else, but because it reduces a lot of the confusion that happens when you're trying to be in a KPI-obsessed company. We are a business, we're trying to do this properly, we're trying to generate revenue. So if I can showcase that, not only will you be able to innovate faster, not only will you be able to leverage emerging tech faster, not only will you be able to have more and more safety in different areas by using open source software and stuff like that, now it becomes a much more compelling argument rather than staying in the same way that you are, which, by the way, is not helping anyone. I'll terminate on this one point. Satya Nadella recently published, I think like a tweet or something like that, in which he said, in the past 2 months, there's been more digital transformation happening than in the past 2 years. So people are understanding that this is, like you mentioned in the very beginning, every business is a tech business. Your ability to kind of adapt to it properly and use technology intelligently and ethically is something that we are trying to help our clients with today.
Kerry, listen, the part that fascinates me the most about the work you do, and it's the time for me to wrap up, is how you were able to turn the idea of from equilibrium to entropy into actually the way that your entity is thinking about technology. And I think that's fascinating. Listen, I shared the report that Capgemini has produced about future thinking on the chat. And I think just by putting your name on Google, they will find also videos and the work you've done so far. Listen, this was great to have you. It's always nice to see you somehow sharing your thought processes. And I look forward to the next iteration, which in our case will happen tomorrow. Right?
Yeah, exactly. And thank you again for having me over here. And if you guys want to reach out and ask me questions about the work that you're doing or how we can help your firms, you can find my LinkedIn profile on the chat box as well. So feel free to reach out. Right. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Gary. So I invite again now Lara to join for our final chat with the tech leader, and of course back Nick as the moderator. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. Thank you, Lara, for joining us early Montana time and for being our last speaker this morning. Now, for those of you who don't know Lara, she's another close friend of mine and another transdisciplinary expert, leaning this time towards sustainability and technology. And now, Lara, you started really in the policy realm on the Hill, focusing on trade with two senators there, and then you became more global by moving to the WTO and the World Economic Forum, and progressively more sustainable with the shift then to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. But more recently, as a technology leader, you've been the Chief Sustainability Officer at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, and now the shift to more the Silicon Valley startup end, rather than the startups of yesteryear with hospitality startup and Airbnb competitor Sonder. So we're really excited to end this fireside chat session with hearing from you. And in particular, I want to kind of start with this question of what's it like to have worked between the big end of tech firms, the big HPE kind of angle on questions of sustainability and partnership, and now with an up-and-coming disruptor in the hospitality space. And what kind of interesting tips and stories can you tell us about sustainability and partnerships from that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Nick, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to see you and some familiar faces here. So yeah, it's such an interesting comparison, right, between the journey of a large multinational and thinking about sustainability versus pre-IPO startup SME sized business. And I think, it's changed so much just in the last couple of years, frankly, for the better, for a number of reasons. So whereas you have in HPE a foundational company in Silicon Valley that had a long history of a sustainability journey and had established that over many, many years, it was really, so much was already in place. And from reporting frameworks to materiality to thinking about those things. And what excited me so much about moving to an earlier stage business and one that was quite new was really figuring out how do we actually incorporate those responsible business practices really early on in a business so that this becomes foundational from a cultural perspective and from a business operating perspective. So, in a future world, maybe we don't need big vertically integrated sustainability teams. Maybe this is how we train the trainer, and these are just the businesses that have those principles throughout. And there are a few of those that do exist, but not enough in my mind. And so I think one of the ways, to bring that back to the technology component, it doesn't have to be necessarily the role of AI or 3D printing or blockchain per se. One of the real opportunities with smaller businesses is what are the technologies that we can bring in to actually leverage that earlier? And supply chain transparency is a big one. It's amazing how many new startup companies and new technologies I'm seeing that are available now to earlier stage businesses, from carbon footprinting to supply chain transparency, even to reporting, and rethinking some of these reporting frameworks too. How can we be incredibly transparent but still light so that this is actually realistic for more and more companies to actually enter into at an early stage?
Interesting, and it reminds me of something that Carrie said, which was that every business is a tech business, which is another way of saying that every business is leveraging technology. Now, HPE and Sonder are very different businesses, right? HPE is switching and connection equipment and a huge amount of services related to that enterprise space. Sonder is a disruptive player in hospitality, where it offers it offers really a service, right? So it still has contractual agreements, but it's not producing technological widgets. It's producing consumer experiences and solving other problems. So for you, when you look at reporting and sustainability, how do you get your head around these kind of sustainability questions when you think about a disruptive platform like Sonder, where it's dematerialized in many ways, yet it still has to have responsibility for those assets, those relationships?
Yeah, no, it's a great observation, because this is everything from B2B, so that's one big difference on the HPE side, and Sonder is obviously very consumer facing and completely different to your point, applications and integrations of technology. And I completely agree with Carrie's point, like all companies are technology companies now. In our case, in Sonder's case, I would describe that as tech-enabled hospitality. So everything from the lobby being in the palm of your hand and your phone, to a digital concierge, to keyless entry. These are the ways that we have kind of evolved to be next generation of hospitality. But I don't know that we would compare that to the HPEs of technology. It's just that this integration is becoming so seamless. And reporting and accountability. So in some ways, because we're consumer facing, it is different. Of course, we're not publicly traded yet, but the things that have changed so much, I would say even just in the last 5 years, are the vigilance that consumers have in understanding where and how they spend their money, and the positions and the business practices of the businesses that they choose to spend their money with. Investors are incredibly aware of those principles and frankly now understand that that's a proxy for a sound and durable business. So there's additional scrutiny and frankly incentives from the investor world to think more rigorously about these things. And then there's employee engagement, and I think we're fortunate to have a generation that is more and more aware of this and is holding their employer accountable in ways that we haven't seen in the past, to have those kinds of policies both externally and internally that make them really proud to work for those businesses. And they have a lot of options now. So it's great to see that this has changed so much, certainly in the journey of business integrating with sustainability over the last 30 years. But really, I would say I've seen a huge shift just since coming back to the States in the last 5 years, and in how people are holding business leaders accountable for social and environmental issues that we wouldn't have seen previously.
So then that big shift in terms of consumer awareness, ability as a driver of value, particularly for certain services, and I think particularly services that you engage in that forward-looking tech-enabled manner. That's really interesting. And the point you made earlier, which is the ability that business leaders and companies have today to incorporate reporting or engagement or measurement systems around sustainability has just exploded, because those services are available not as an internal audit function, but as a plug and play cloud service. That makes starting a business today and wanting to invest in sustainability a lot easier. There's a third component to all of this often, which is in your title as well, which is partnerships. So it's not just about how you relate to your primary engagers or how you leverage technology in your consumers. It's also about who you ally yourself with more value. What kind of partnerships are you seeing as most interesting and useful to bring the whole ecosystem up? And where should leaders be looking at to find some more interesting ways to do that than, say, partnering with the old world of provider in that area?
Yeah, and we actually have a nice example from this year, actually, in the midst of COVID. And it's a really good example of, I would say, collaboration across nonprofits and amongst other companies. So we launched a partnership with Lyft, the rideshare provider, and a startup nonprofit called Off Their Plate that originated actually as a result of COVID. And the premise of Off Their Plate was to provide hospital workers with meals by bringing restaurant workers in select restaurants back to provide those meals to the restaurant workers. So we were helping to provide employment as well as meals. And so we partnered with Lyft to provide rides to the restaurant workers, and then Sonder ran a campaign in addition to a donation to ensure that there was more money that was actually donated to that cause over the course of about 6 weeks. And, I would say that Sonder, as a smaller business that's less known, obviously, than a Lyft, I was very grateful for that collaboration with a known purpose-driven company. And I suppose it's just a great example for many of us to take, which is there are many ways we can all lift each other up. At an HPE, we would have been that lead company, but I think what impressed me a lot was the willingness of that collaboration there, and the ability for all of us to have more impact in doing so. And so we'll, I think as a smaller business that is really on that journey, we'll probably look for similar partnerships. And I hope that when we're at a similar stage to a Lyft, that we can provide the same for others that are looking for ways to have a positive impact in their communities.
For you, what do you expect will change kind of post IPO, and as Sonder continues to grow, and assuming that as is in Carrie's model, assuming that Sonder and the community is in the upward bit of the K-shaped recovery and not the downward leg of that very arresting image of fragmentation and bifurcation in the economy, how are you planning to continue that sustainability story through a period of rapid growth and evolution? Because one of the things I've known from working with startups is they look very different kind of 3 years later, and they look very different pre and post IPO for lots of reasons. Is that something that you thought about as a tech leader, to how you keep this culture and these values lived through the growth and evolution of the firm?
I think it's actually easier because we're doing it now, and because the senior leadership and our CEO has had the foresight to consider what this looks like well before an IPO. So, in many ways, that is a really authentic integration. It prepares us well for the future of ESG reporting. The big advantage of looking at these metrics, whether it's in an official reporting context or just in those frameworks right now, is that it gives us a really powerful lens ourselves into the business and the ways that we can improve, and the ways that we're already doing really well. So I think it actually just sets us up for a really strong public presence in a way that would be harder to do if we were only thinking about this a few years down the road. And that's definitely probably one of the big learnings from multinationals that were established long before this was such an integrated function, to the advantage of insight that new companies have, which is that this is an expectation, that understanding our social and environmental impact and how we are partners in communities is just an expectation now that we have. And so there's no reason for us to wait to consider what this looks like. We can do it early and often, and with any luck, it just becomes part of the DNA of the business.
Is this becoming more common, Lara? Do you see in your community in San Francisco, in Sonder's investors, et cetera, that others are taking the lead of hiring and appointing and building skills and systems early stage, set it up? Is that something that you see?
Yeah, I have seen a lot of that, particularly on the social impact side. I would say there are a lot at kind of a manager tier. I think that, one of the things we can't lose sight of is that there has to be, senior buy-in for this to really be integrated. And so it's great that there are manager level supports. And as long as that is supported by senior leadership, it's a wonderful evolution to see so many more sustainability professionals at that tier. I think it's completely changed in recent years. We just have to keep our eyes set on the reporting of that internally to make sure that it remains a core value, and that there's vigilance from boards and others to really understand what that means and to make sure it's material. but yeah, I'm incredibly encouraged that there are more and more businesses thinking about this.
And I'm incredibly excited that Sonda managed to get you and your expertise in there to help them as they grow. I'm also really appreciative for you spending the time with us this morning, and for everyone online for joining us. Laundry, do you want to come in and say thanks as we hit the hour to everyone, or shall we finish the session on this very positive note? Lara, I will.
Thanks so much, Nick.
Thank you, Lara. I'll give Laundry a second to see if he wants to pop in and say thanks. But on the off chance in the platform that he doesn't, I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join this fireside chat with tech leaders. We started with Anja Kaspersen, really from that security, international geopolitics perspective. We went from Carrie to Capgemini for that fascinating look at the future of tech trends and engagement. And we finished here with Lara from Sonda talking about sustainability and technology. It's my great delight to work with Laundry and Mark on these things. So Laundry and Mark, if you want to close us off, we'll send everyone off to their next fantastic session in the Thunderbird ASU studio. Laundry.
So yes, thank you very much, Mark and Nick, for moderating those wonderful fireside chats, and for our incredible speaker who have shared great insight on what the future will be made of. So I would like also to thank all the members of our audience, and without taking a longer time, because I know that it is already time to hand over the panel, I would like to say thank you again to our team, including Derek and Anne, who have worked on this extremely important panel, Kelly, among other, and the entire Thunderbird team. A special thanks to our Dean, Dean Kagram, Director General of the Thunderbird School of Global Management.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you from my side, guys. Thanks again. It was great. We're just getting started now, right? We need another session. All the best. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.